Well, we've got some breaking news out of Saudi Arabia today. Apparently, the Saudi Aramco's headquarters has been bombed by the Houthis, and according to some journalist who I believe was on the ground there, I'd have to double check. I was reading this in Zero Hedge, but it's being reported other places like Bloomberg and such. It seems as though some Saudi oil tankers were hit in the port. So big oil spill probably there, a lot of oil being lost. It's going to interrupt the supply chain. Saudi Aramco, which is, the Saudi government, is the biggest oil company in the world. So if they have a problem, something like getting bombed that interrupts their supply chain, that's going to have a serious effect on the price of oil, which I believe starts trading in just a few minutes. When the futures market opens up at 6:30 Eastern Time, 5:30 Central. And so while we won't know exactly what kind of an effect this will have, we know how intense the effect will be. We will know that the effect will be to the upside. And rising oil prices, we don't know if, let me put it this way before I get to that. We need to determine whether this rise is just going to be sort of transitory or sustained. What I mean by that is the oil price going to just spike because there's a scare, and then in 2 days, the Saudis will be back to full capacity, and oil prices will return to where they closed on Friday, essentially, which oil prices are already rising for other reasons, part of which being, I think, general inflation of commodities that we're seeing across the board. Gas prices in the U.S. Have been creeping up for quite a bit now. And, of course, you have the new Biden administration being much more hawkish on oil drilling and on extending drilling permits than the previous administration, which is going to be a headwind moving forward because the U.S. oil industry doesn't do well with low oil prices, where they've been, for most of the Trump administration. Trump, in his years, oversaw, the decimation of the U.S. oil industry. And that's not a bad thing. It's just because oil prices were low, and U.S. oil companies are very inefficient relative to places like Saudi Arabia, to where essentially a guy in his backyard with a shovel can find oil. These Americans, we struggle just because of the nature of our oil resources. We have this shale stuff, which is very expensive to process. And so our oil industry really doesn't, it can't even afford to operate without sufficiently high oil prices. But that's good, but it still is useful because when oil prices start to rise, the U.S. Companies can sort of come online. They can start producing oil, and that will help alleviate some of that upward pressure on the oil price, and keep it sort of capped at a certain level. But with this new administration being a bit more restrictive on the oil industry, if we see a sustained rise in oil prices, it will take longer, and perhaps, it will be less possible overall for U.S. companies to begin producing more oil. You won't see, new drilling permits being issued as easily. The Keystone Pipeline, for example, is already, axed. That's not going to get finished. So that pipelines are a much more efficient way of moving oil around than, say, trucks, which is what we use now to get oil from Canada to the U.S. And so you also have the problem that even if all of the stars aligned and you had a very pro-oil administration in there, like Trump was, who wanted to, within the confines of the permanent bureaucracy, wanted to be as lenient as possible on new oil exploration. It still would take a long time for these shale producers, which have largely gone belly up at this point, for people to come in to buy up those old fields, to try and restart drilling and processing oil to the point to where they could actually start selling their product on the market. That would take a while. So oil prices would have to be high for quite some time before the U.S. can even start coming in to produce more oil to bring the price down. Because Saudi Arabia, them and OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the OPEC cartel, they voted this past Friday, I believe it was, to keep in their current limits on production. So in the face of rising oil prices, OPEC said, no, we're not going to raise production. We're going to keep production the same. So oil prices will continue to rise. The only way for oil prices to come down then is either for demand to fall, which I don't think is going to happen, or it's, at least not in the short term, I don't think demand's going to fall, or you have other countries like the US, Canada, producing more oil themselves, raising their production. But even still, that takes time. And so the OPEC folks know that they have time before the shale producers can get back up and running, because from what I understand of shale oil, I can't remember exactly what the threshold is, but I don't think oil is high enough even now for them to really make a decent profit, because their costs per barrel are just too high. So that's sort of the economic side of this story. Now, there's also a geopolitical war and peace side to this story, and that is that this was an airstrike by the Houthis as part of the ongoing Saudi war in Yemen. The Houthis are trying to essentially hit back at Saudi Arabia a little bit, do some damage to them, since the Saudis have leveled most of Yemen over the past few years. But according to the Saudis, unlike the Saudi airstrikes in Yemen, the Houthi airstrikes, Saudi Arabia, have not killed anybody, and that's according to the Saudis themselves. They're saying nobody died. So it would seem, and I think this is pretty well confirmed, that the Houthis, warned Saudi Arabia ahead of time. Hey, we're going to be bombing, X facility. Get your people out of them. We want to just, because they, I guess, legitimate military target. That's what they're doing. Because no matter how much the Saudis want to claim, oh, Saudi Aramco, that's a civilian company. Well, it's owned by your government. It is the state oil company. Obviously, the state oil company is a pretty big component of state power. It's the whole reason why the Saudis have power and influence and money that they can spend on Raytheon bombs to drop on Yemen. Striking Saudi oil facilities is, trying to cut out the heart of the beast. If you are a country that's at war with Saudi Arabia. Now the hawks, I guess, who are still pro-Saudi, and I don't know how many of them are still willing to poke their heads up, because the Saudis are not very popular amongst ordinary Americans. But to the extent that pro-Saudi hawks do still exist, they will be blaming this on Biden's change in designation for the Houthis, undeclaring them a terrorist organization, which Mike Pompeo did in the last couple of weeks of the Trump administration. It was a very short-term thing. Well, the Saudis are going to make the argument, oh, the Houthis have been emboldened by Biden declaring that they're not terrorists. And so now they're committing acts of terror with impunity. And, of course, it's ridiculous. This is not terrorism compared to what the Saudis do in Yemen. I mean, if you want to call this terrorism, then I don't know what you call the Saudis. You have to call them something worse than just mere terrorists. But if there was ever anything that could drag other countries, namely the United States, more directly into the war in Yemen, interfering on Saudi's behalf, I would think it would be an act like this. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword as far as the Houthis are concerned. Yes, attacking their oil facilities, if you're just looking at trying to cripple Saudi Arabia, makes a lot of sense. But crippling Saudi Arabia's oil production is going to have a negative impact on the rest of the world, including the United States. The United States has an interest in keeping oil prices affordable for their own economy, because no president likes to preside over a depression, and that's exactly where the U.S. would be stuck if oil prices were not sufficiently low. And so if the Houthis conflict with Saudi Arabia, if the existence of the Houthis is causing oil prices to remain above a certain level, to push oil prices sufficiently high, then I could very easily see the hawks justifying a war against the Houthis in Yemen in the name of national security, because it's just destabilizing the Gulf, and if the Gulf is destabilized, the whole world is going to be destabilized. I think that if we were, in the Obama years, Well, I shouldn't. I don't have to say if, because I know that Obama interfered in Yemen on Saudi Arabia's behalf. But Obama might have been more direct. He might have been even boots on the ground in Yemen if something like this, were to happen back then. But these days, I just don't know how that's going to fly. Thankfully, there's been growing opposition to the Yemen war in Congress for the last couple of years, and I just don't know how you would escalate it and make it, a real, well, more real than it even is now, an American war. I just don't think that there's enough of an appetite for that. I think there would be too big of a pushback, and the Biden folks, not Biden himself, because he doesn't think, but the Biden folks, I don't know if they're that committed to this, that they would do that. If this were 2005, definitely, yeah. I mean, GW back then, he would have been, send in the army, send in the tanks. We're going to smash the Houthis and make Yemen into a beautiful democracy. But, we had a similar scare last year, was it? No, maybe it was 2 years ago with Yemen and Saudi Arabia, where the Houthis did drone bomb Saudi Aramco facility, and the Saudis came out immediately, said, oh my gosh, this is terrible, we won't be able to, we're going to be down for months. People thought, oh my gosh, what's this going to do to oil production? There's going to be this huge gap, and drop off in supply on the international oil markets. And oil's going to go to 500 a barrel, or I don't know if anybody actually said that, but it was a pretty scary time because you didn't know what was going to happen. And then miraculously, within 3 weeks, turns out it wasn't as bad as the Saudis told us, and they were back up and running at full production. And so we may be looking at a very similar situation here, to where this attack is not going to do any long-term damage, and it's not going to inhibit the Saudis' ability to continue to export oil. And so we'll just have to monitor this going forward and see what more news and what more information about this attack comes out. So with that said, I think I will leave it off there for today.